So think about a modern pulp and paper mill for a second. It's not really just a factory, right? It's more like this colossal, incredibly hungry engine. I mean, this engine is running day and night, just devouring vast amounts of raw materials and power, all to produce things like the packaging, office paper, and industrial materials that we literally rely on every single day. But, like any massive engine out there, what goes in dictates exactly what comes out of the exhaust. And today, we're zooming in on that exhaust. We're looking specifically at the direct greenhouse gases originating in these mills. And here's the kicker, the hidden financial costs buried right there in the smoke. Okay, let's dive into this explainer and really uncover how companies are managing their regulatory carbon exposure.
We've got a super clear roadmap for our analysis today. First up, powering the paper mill. Then we'll be decoding Scope 1 emissions. After that, we look at fossil fuels versus biomass, move on to managing regulatory carbon risk, and finally wrap things up with the energy efficiency advantage.
All right, Section 1, powering the paper mill, or as I like to call it, the engine of the industry.
Let's just establish exactly how much energy we are talking about here. What does it genuinely take to power one of these paper mills? Honestly, the sheer scale is staggering. You have to imagine the energy demand of an entire small city, just packed into a single industrial facility. Pulp and paper manufacturing is just so intensely energy demanding. These places require constant, massive inputs of energy for heavy materials processing and generating super high-pressure steam. And when you've got an engine running this hot and this hard, the emissions generated are, well, substantial. But throughout our journey today, we're going to use what I call a dual ledger mindset. Because here's the thing, those emissions, they aren't just an environmental metric anymore, they are a direct financial liability. That is the true hidden cost lingering in the smoke.
Moving on to Section 2, decoding Scope 1 emissions, which is really all about understanding the carbon footprint. To really grasp that financial risk we just talked about, we first have to clearly define the footprint itself. In sustainability accounting, professionals look at something called gross global Scope 1 emissions. Now, by definition, these are the direct greenhouse gas emissions released straight into the atmosphere from sources that the company actually owns or controls. And to make sure everyone across the globe is measuring this the exact same way, these are calculated according to the methodology contained in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That's essentially the gold standard corporate accounting and reporting framework established by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development.
So where exactly inside the mill are these emissions actually coming from? Now, what's really interesting about this is that we aren't just talking about one giant smokestack. We're looking at combustion happening all over the place, in stationary and mobile engines on-site, in these massive cogeneration boilers, and in all sorts of other heavy processing equipment. The fuel that's actually feeding these fires typically falls into two main buckets, the burning of fossil fuels and the burning of biomass. Both of them generate direct emissions, absolutely. But as you'll see in just a moment, they are treated very differently on our dual ledger.
When those fuels burn, they release a specific, highly regulated cocktail of gases. The standards actually require entities to disclose emissions that are covered under the Kyoto Protocol. The heavy hitters that get tracked here are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And to make sense of it all these different gases have to be consolidated and disclosed in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. They calculate that using a 100-year time horizon global warming potential. Basically, this just ensures we have a standardized measure of the actual climate impact, completely regardless of which specific gas is escaping the boiler. Which brings us to Section 3, fossil fuels versus biomass, or what I call the fuel fork. This is a pretty critical fork in the road for mill operators. How you decide to feed the mill completely determines your financial exposure. So the crucial point is the stark contrast between these two different fuel sources. On one side, you have fossil fuels. Relying heavily on them exposes a company to super volatile purchase costs and high regulatory carbon risk. On the flip side, we have biogenic biomass. Because entities in this industry naturally generate significant amounts of biomass themselves, using it for energy is actually considered carbon neutral in this specific context. Utilizing this alternative energy can massively reduce the cost associated with buying fossil fuels, all while directly mitigating the regulatory risk tied to carbon emissions. It's a win-win, right?
Well, hold on, because it's vital to note that biomass is not some perfect magic bullet without its own ledger of risks. Burning biomass still generates other air emissions. Mill operators still have to manage pollutants like oxides of nitrogen, you'll hear that called NOx, and oxides of sulfur, or SO2, as well as particulate matter. Failing to control those can absolutely lead to hefty compliance costs or even reputational damage. Plus, there are sourcing risks to think about. If a company lacks transparency about whether their purchased biomass was actually sustainably harvested,
Or if it fails to meet the strict definition of an eligible renewable under local standards, yeah, those regulatory benefits we just talked about can evaporate pretty quickly. All right, let's head into Section 4, Managing Regulatory Carbon Risk, exploring the compliance ledger. Let's look a little closer at how those emissions directly hit the bottom line through this compliance ledger. Emissions associated with fossil fuel sources add direct regulatory compliance costs. This happens whenever mills operate under specific regional, national, or even international emission limiting programs. Take a look at these frameworks. If a mill is operating under the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, the Quebec Cap-and-Trade System, or the California Cap-and-Trade Program, their Scope 1 emissions are subject to very strict caps and pricing. Literally, every extra ton of greenhouse gas emitted is a direct financial penalty. It completely turns environmental tracking into a pure financial compliance exercise.
There's a quote from the Sustainability Accounting Standards that perfectly summarizes the core dynamic here. It says, entities that cost-effectively manage GHG emissions may benefit from improved operating efficiency and reduced regulatory compliance costs. And that is just a direct one-to-one translation. Think about it. Reducing a ton of emitted carbon doesn't just look good on a glossy sustainability report. It is essentially saving $1 or potentially millions of dollars of regulatory exposure and operational waste. And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, the energy efficiency advantage, which acts as a financial shield. If carbon is a cost, then efficiency is the ultimate financial shield. Let's move to and see how this builds a really resilient operational strategy. You see, companies are actively pivoting to protect themselves against volatile fuel prices and those tightening regulations through 3 key steps. Step 1, pushing for greater energy efficiency. Basically, just doing more materials processing with less overall energy. Step 2, alternative fuels use. This means strategically shifting their balance away from fossil fuels and towards sustainably sourced carbon-neutral biomass. And finally, Step 3, manufacturing process improvements. This is where they upgrade the physical engine of the mill, the boilers and the processing equipment itself, to completely optimize the entire system. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how this dual ledger is tracked and reported out to investors. Investors want to see the hard quantitative data for gross global Scope 1 emissions, right alongside the total energy consumed and the percentages of grid electricity versus biomass. By tracking both of those things together, stakeholders can clearly evaluate exactly how well a company is managing the risks and the trade-offs of powering their operations. It lays it all out on the table. So we've seen how the pulp and paper industry really has to meticulously balance its energy hunger with its environmental and financial outputs. The engine absolutely must run, but the cost of the smoke is higher than it's ever been. Which leaves us with a pretty compelling thought to close on today. As carbon markets continue to expand and evolve globally, will this dual ledger mindset, where literally every environmental metric is inextricably linked to a hard financial cost, become a strict, unavoidable requirement for all heavy manufacturing industries? It is a fascinating shift in how we value industrial efficiency, and for sure, it's something to keep your eye on.